April 29th, 1976, 3 o'clock in the morning. A 26-year-old rock musician stands outside the gates of Graceland, staring up at lights glowing in the windows. He's just finished a concert in Memphis, and instead of heading back to his hotel, he's made a choice that will become one of rock and roll's most infamous stories. What happens next involves climbing a wall, security guards appearing from the bushes, and an explanation that starts with the words, "I was just on the cover of Time and Newsweek." This is the night Bruce Springsteen tried to meet Elvis Presley. To understand why a grown man would scale the walls of Graceland in the middle of the night, you need to go back 20 years earlier. Back to a small house in Freehold, New Jersey, where a 7-year-old boy sat in front of a television screen watching The Ed Sullivan Show. It was January 6th, 1957, Elvis Presley's third and final appearance on the program. The king came out wearing a blount shirt and vest, makeup painted around his eyes, looking nothing like the clean-cut performers that usually graced America's television screens. When he started to move, when that guitar became both weapon and armor, something shifted in that New Jersey living room. Young Bruce watched Elvis perform Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender, and Hound Dog. The way Elvis stood on his toes, the way he moved his hips, the way the audience screamed. It wasn't just music, it was transformation happening in real time, broadcast into living rooms across the country. For a boy growing up in a working-class Catholic family in Freehold, New Jersey, this was a window into another world entirely. Bruce Springsteen would later describe the moment with an intensity that never faded. He talked about how television and Elvis gave everyone full access to a new language, a new form of communication, a new way of being, of looking, of thinking about identity and life itself. For a 7-year-old kid in a working-class family, watching someone transform himself so completely was revolutionary. The impact was immediate and profound. Springsteen later said it was the evening he realized a white man could make magic, that you didn't have to be constrained by your upbringing, by the way you looked, or by the social context around you. You could call upon your own powers of imagination and create a transformative self. That television appearance showed him that reinvention was possible. The young Springsteen couldn't imagine anyone not wanting to be Elvis Presley. That night, Elvis smiled and smirked and played with the audience. He sang hits that shook his hips and made girls scream. This was the dream, laid out in black and white television, broadcast into homes across America. This was what was possible. Bruce pleaded with his mother to buy him a guitar after that. Day after day, he begged. Adele Springsteen finally gave in, even took out a loan she probably couldn't afford to get him a Kent guitar and set up lessons. But his hands were too small, and he struggled with formal instruction. The teacher wanted him to learn songs he had no interest in playing. The guitar got put aside for sports, but the seed had been planted. Elvis had whispered a dream, and somehow young Bruce had heard it. Years would pass before Springsteen picked up the guitar again. He'd struggle in school, feeling like an outsider. A nun once stuffed him in a garbage can under her desk, telling him that's where he belonged. He was even knocked down by a priest during Mass when he was an altar boy. These experiences of not fitting in, of being rejected by the institutions that were supposed to nurture him, would later fuel his music. But they also made that image of Elvis more powerful. Elvis had been an outsider too, and he'd transformed himself into something magnificent. Fast forward to 1975. Bruce Springsteen was no longer that small-handed kid struggling with guitar lessons. He'd spent years grinding it out on the Jersey Shore, playing bars and clubs like the Stone Pony in Asbury Park, building his sound with the group that would become the E Street Band. He'd released 2 albums that got critical praise but didn't sell. His first album, Greetings from Asbury Park, came out in 1973. Critics called him the new Bob Dylan, a label that would follow him for years and that he'd spend just as long trying to escape. The second album, The Wild, The Innocent, and The E Street Shuffle, was even better received critically but still didn't find a mass audience. Springsteen was running out of chances. The music industry wasn't patient. If the third album didn't hit, Columbia Records might drop him. Then came Born to Run, the album that changed everything. Released in August of 1975, it was the sound of someone pouring every ounce of energy and desperation into one last shot at making it. Springsteen and his producer worked for months to get the sound right, layering guitars and keyboards and saxophones until they'd created this massive wall of sound. The lyrics were about everyday working class life presented in dramatic, almost cinematic terms. Kids trying to escape dead end towns, girls named Wendy and Mary, thunder roads and streets of fire. This wasn't just another album, this was a statement. Critics went wild. The music press declared Springsteen the future of rock and roll. Rolling Stone ran features. Music magazines that had been covering him since the beginning felt vindicated. And in an almost unprecedented move, both Time and Newsweek put him on their covers in the same week in October 1975. The headlines called him rock's new sensation and drew comparisons to Bob Dylan. At 26 years old, Bruce Springsteen was becoming famous. But fame in 1976 was different than it would be later. Springsteen wasn't a household name yet. Born to Run had peaked at number 3 on the album charts, which was great but not massive. If you followed rock music closely, you knew who he was. If you read the right magazines, you'd seen those covers. But security guards at a mansion in Memphis? They probably hadn't. Average Americans watching television? Many had never heard of him. He was famous in the rock world, but the rock world was smaller then. The Born to Run tour was Springsteen's chance to bring his music to audiences who'd only read about him. City by city, venue by venue, he and the E Street Band played marathon shows that could stretch past 4 hours. These weren't just concerts. They were celebrations, communions, everything Springsteen had learned about what rock and roll could be. He'd take requests from the audience. He'd tell stories between songs. He'd play until everyone was exhausted, including himself. The shows were earning him a reputation as one of the greatest live performers in rock and roll. People who saw him once told their friends. Word spread. But he was still building that reputation one show at a time, one city at a time. He hadn't reached the stratosphere yet. He was on his way, but he wasn't there. On April 29, 1976, the tour rolled into Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis meant something to Springsteen. This was Elvis's city. This was where Sun Records had been, where rock and roll had been born. And of course, this was where Graceland stood. Bruce Springsteen, riding high on newfound fame and the energy that comes from playing your heart out every night, was about to make a decision that would become legend. But before we get to that moment at the gates, it's worth understanding what else was happening. Springsteen was dealing with the weight of those magazine covers, the pressure of being called the future of rock and roll. He was learning what it meant to be famous, to have expectations placed on him, to be scrutinized by critics who'd built him up and might tear him down. In some ways, he was more vulnerable than he'd ever been. The show at Ellis Auditorium was done. 4 hours of pure energy. But Springsteen wasn't tired. He was wired the way you get after pouring everything into a performance. You can't just switch that off and go to sleep. So when someone mentioned going to find an all-night diner, Springsteen and guitarist Steve Van Zandt jumped at the idea. They caught a cab. According to Springsteen's later recollections, they asked the driver if he knew where they could find a diner. The driver mentioned there was one out by Elvis's house. And just like that, the entire plan changed. Elvis's house. Not just any house, Graceland. The place Bruce had probably imagined 1,000 times. The home of the man who'd changed his life when he was 7 years old, sitting in front of that television in New Jersey. The taxi driver knew where Elvis lived, and suddenly finding a diner didn't matter anymore. The cab rolled up to 3764 Elvis Presley Boulevard. It was past 3 in the morning. The gates were locked, the stone wall looming in the darkness. But there were lights on in the house. You could see them from the street, glowing in the second-story windows. Springsteen looked at those lights. He looked at Van Zandt. And he made his choice. He was going in. The taxi driver tried to talk him out of it, warned him about the dogs, about security, about all the reasons this was a terrible idea. But Springsteen's mind was made up. When would this opportunity come again? He'd spent his entire life admiring Elvis Presley from afar. Now he was standing outside his house, and there were lights on, which meant someone was awake. Maybe Elvis himself. So Bruce Springsteen, fresh off the cover of Time and Newsweek, climbed over that stone wall and started running up the driveway toward the mansion. He didn't make it far. Just as Springsteen reached the front door, just as he was about to knock, a security guard emerged from the bushes. The kind of moment that probably seemed more dramatic to Springsteen than it did to the guard, who'd done this before with other enthusiastic fans. The guard asked what Springsteen thought he was doing. A reasonable question when someone's just scaled your employer's wall at 3 in the morning. Springsteen asked if Elvis was home. The answer came back simple and final. No, Elvis wasn't home. He was in Lake Tahoe. Which was true. Elvis was performing there, nowhere near Memphis that night. But Springsteen wasn't ready to give up that easily. This was his chance to connect with his hero, and he reached for the only currency he had. He explained that he was Bruce Springsteen, that he'd just been on the cover of both Time and Newsweek magazines, that he was a rock musician himself, someone Elvis might actually want to meet. The security guard was unimpressed. To him, Bruce Springsteen was just another fan who jumped the wall. It happened more often than you'd think. Fans climbed the walls regularly, hid in trees, swam in the pool. One enterprising person had even made it inside the house once and sat in the den waiting for Elvis, hoping to interest him in songs he'd written. He didn't get that meeting either. Security at Graceland had seen it all. The front gate area at Graceland was normally a gathering place for fans. They'd hang out there hoping Elvis might drive through in one of his cars or on a motorcycle. Sometimes he'd ride down on a golf cart or on horseback and have an impromptu autograph session. Even when Elvis was out of town, fans would gather at the gates, getting to know the guards and meeting other fans from around the nation and the world. It was its own kind of community, but climbing the wall was different. That crossed a line. Some of the guards were Elvis's relatives, people who'd grown up with him or been brought into the organization because of family connections. They took their jobs seriously, and they'd been doing this long enough to know that everyone had a story. Everyone thought they had a good reason to be there. And in 1976, if you weren't already famous enough that security recognized you on sight, your magazine covers didn't mean much at 3 in the morning. The guard told Springsteen he'd relay the message to Elvis, let him know that Bruce Springsteen had been there. Whether he actually did that, we'll never know. But it was a polite way of ending the encounter. The guard, still professional, walked Springsteen back down the driveway, out through the gates, and deposited him on the sidewalk where Van Zant was presumably still waiting. The whole adventure had lasted maybe 10 minutes. From climbing the wall to being escorted back out, it was over almost as soon as it began. That was as close as Bruce Springsteen ever got to meeting Elvis Presley. He'd made it to the front door, but the door never opened. The dream stayed on the other side, unreachable. Years later, when Springsteen told this story on stage, he'd talk about wondering what he would have said if Elvis had actually answered the door. Because the truth was, it wasn't really Elvis he'd been going to see. Not the man, anyway. It was the idea, the dream, the thing Elvis represented. Springsteen understood something important about fame and mythology. Elvis had come along and whispered a dream in everybody's ear, and somehow they'd all dreamed it together. That's what made him special. He wasn't just a talented musician. He was a portal to possibility, proof that you could transform yourself into something bigger than your circumstances. Standing outside those gates, getting escorted back to the street by security, Springsteen had to confront the gap between the myth and reality. He'd carried Elvis with him for 19 years, from that moment watching The Ed Sullivan Show to this moment in Memphis. And now he was being turned away from the mansion, told his hero wasn't even home. The disappointment must have been crushing. Not because he was rejected by security. That part probably didn't matter much. But because the whole thing highlighted something he'd been avoiding thinking about. Elvis in 1976 wasn't the same Elvis who'd appeared on television in 1957. Time had passed. Things had changed. But that night, Springsteen didn't know just how much things had changed. He didn't know what was coming next. All he knew was that he'd climbed a wall, run across a lawn, and been sent away. The dream remained untouched, preserved in amber exactly as it had been when he was 7 years old. May 28th, 1977. 14 months after the Graceland incident, Springsteen and Van Zandt went to see Elvis Presley perform at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. This time, they wouldn't have to climb any walls. They had tickets like everyone else, but what they saw that night was hard to watch. Elvis looked old. He looked tired. The man on that stage bore little resemblance to the electric presence Springsteen remembered from television or even from Elvis's recordings. The show was rough, the performance scattered. This was Elvis in decline, struggling through another concert on another tour that was grinding him down. Springsteen later described it carefully, trying to be respectful while being honest. It wasn't a good night. For someone who'd idolized Elvis his entire life, watching his hero struggle must have been painful. The dream was cracking, revealing something more human and more vulnerable underneath. But instead of letting the disappointment consume him, Springsteen did what he always did. He went home and wrote a song. He called it Fire, and he wrote it specifically for Elvis Presley. It was meant to be a song Elvis could record, something that might fit his style, particularly the rockabilly sound of his early recordings. Springsteen recorded the song on June 17th, 1977, just weeks after seeing that Philadelphia concert. He even sang it in a style that evoked Elvis, trying to show him how it might sound. According to Springsteen, he sent a demo to Elvis, hoping his idol might hear something in it worth recording. Elvis Presley died on August 16th, 1977. The demo, if it was sent, never reached him in time. Or if it did, he never got the chance to record it. Bruce Springsteen would never know if Elvis heard the song he'd written for him. Fire became one of those songs that took on a life of its own. Springsteen gave it to rockabilly singer Robert Gordon, even played piano on Gordon's recording, though he wasn't credited at the time. Then the Pointer Sisters got hold of it and turned it into a massive hit, taking it to number 2 on the charts in 1979. It was strange in a way. One of Springsteen's most commercially successful songs wasn't even released by him initially. He'd written it for Elvis, given it away after Elvis died, and watched other people make it famous. The Pointer Sisters version became ubiquitous, playing on radio stations across the country. Springsteen had still never had a top 10 hit with his own recordings. Born to Run had only reached number 23 as a single, but he performed Fire live constantly, making it a regular part of his shows. When he introduced it, he'd sometimes tell the story about seeing Elvis in Philadelphia, about writing the song that night. Other times he'd just launch into it, letting the song speak for itself. It became a way to keep Elvis alive, to maintain that connection to the man who'd started everything. The song took on different meanings over the years. In 1978 and 1979, when the Pointer Sisters version was dominating radio, audiences would hear Springsteen play it and recognize it as that hit song, not realizing he'd written it. By the time Live 1975 to 85 came out in 1986 with Springsteen's version, people had started to understand the full story. The song became part of the Springsteen mythology, connected forever to Elvis and that night in Philadelphia. He wouldn't release his own studio version until 2010, as part of the Promise Box set collecting outtakes from the darkness on the Edge of Town sessions. By then, more than 30 years had passed since he'd written it. The studio version revealed something interesting. Springsteen had recorded it trying to sound like Elvis, adopting vocal inflections and phrasing that evoked the king. It was a tribute, an offering, a song designed for someone else to inhabit. Springsteen also wrote another song connected to Elvis. Johnny Bye Bye was more direct, a farewell to the king that acknowledged both the legend and the tragedy. The opening referenced driving past Graceland, seeing fans outside the gates. It was rawer, sadder, more explicit about loss. Where Fire had been written before Elvis died, Johnny Bye Bye came after, processing grief and the end of an era. In interviews and speeches over the years, Springsteen would return again and again to Elvis's influence. He'd talk about that first television appearance, about the impact it had on an entire generation. He understood that Elvis had done something unprecedented, creating a template that countless others, including himself, would follow. Everything started and ended with Elvis, he'd say. It was that simple and that profound. The story of Springsteen climbing the Graceland wall became one of those perfect rock and roll anecdotes. It had everything: a young musician paying homage to his idol, a brazen, middle-of-the-night adventure, security guards, and a perfect anti-climax. Bruce didn't get to meet Elvis. He got escorted off the property. The end. Springsteen told the story often in concert, usually as an introduction to Fire or another Elvis-related song. The details would shift slightly depending on the telling, the way any story does when it's repeated over years. Sometimes he'd emphasize climbing the wall. Sometimes he'd focus on the security guard's reaction. Sometimes he'd talk about what he wanted to say to Elvis if the door had opened. He'd describe seeing those lights on in the windows, the moment of decision at the base of that wall. The story became a regular part of his shows during the Born in the USA tour in the mid-80s, when Springsteen had finally achieved the kind of massive fame that made the incident even more ironic. Here was one of the biggest rock stars in the world, telling audiences about the time security guards didn't recognize him and threw him out. People loved it. It made him relatable, human, someone who'd been rejected just like everyone else. But the core remained constant. A moment of fandom, pure and simple. Bruce Springsteen, future rock legend, reduced to being just another guy who wanted to meet Elvis bad enough to jump a fence at 3 in the morning. In his telling, he never tried to make himself look good, or the guards look bad. It was just what happened, with all its awkwardness and disappointment intact. The fact that security didn't recognize him makes the story better. If they'd said, "Oh, Mr. Springsteen, come right in," it wouldn't have the same impact. The beauty is in the failure, in the mundane reality of being turned away. It humanizes both Springsteen and Elvis, reminds everyone that mythology and reality don't always align. Fame doesn't grant you automatic access. Magazine covers don't open locked doors at 3 in the morning. Over time, the story took on additional layers. People started attaching it to the Fire narrative, suggesting Springsteen had the song with him that night in 1976, trying to deliver it personally. Versions of the story emerged where he claimed to have a song for Elvis, though the timeline doesn't support that. Fire was written in 1977 after the Philadelphia concert, a full year after the Graceland incident. But the conflation makes sense emotionally, so it persisted in retellings. Still, the mixing of details makes sense emotionally. Both stories are about the same thing: Springsteen trying to connect with Elvis, to close the gap between fan and idol, to somehow repay the debt he felt he owed the man who'd changed his life with a television appearance. Whether it happened in 1976 or 1977, whether there was a song involved or just youthful enthusiasm, the impulse was identical. The story also evolved in how audiences received it. In 1976, it would have seemed audacious, maybe even disrespectful. By the 80s and 90s, it had become charming, a window into a different era when rock stars could still be fans, when the machinery of fame hadn't completely separated performers from their influences. By the 2000s, it was part of rock history, told and retold in documentaries and articles about both Springsteen and Elvis. What made the story stick wasn't just the drama of climbing walls at 3 in the morning. It was what it revealed about artistic lineage, about how influence works, about the unbreakable connection between generations of musicians. Elvis had inspired Springsteen. Springsteen had tried to thank him. The attempt failed. But the debt remained, acknowledged in songs and stories, and that Elvis fan club button visible on the Born to Run cover. Here's an interesting footnote to the story. While Springsteen never got to meet Elvis, Elvis apparently knew who Springsteen was. George Klein, one of Elvis's childhood friends who stayed close to him throughout his life, later said that Elvis liked Springsteen. He'd noticed how quickly Springsteen came on the scene, appreciated that he was a rock and roller in an era when rock and roll was fragmenting into different genres. So when that security guard told Elvis about the scruffy musician who'd climbed the wall claiming to be on the cover of magazines, Elvis might have actually known the name. He might have been curious. Or maybe he was just tired, dealing with his own struggles and wasn't up for surprise visitors at 3 in the morning. We'll never know what might have happened if Elvis had been home that night. Would he have come to the door? Would he have invited Springsteen in? Would they have talked about music? About the torch being passed from one generation to the next? Springsteen himself wondered about this. He'd say in concerts that he used to imagine what he would have told Elvis. But the more time passed, the more he realized it wasn't about having a conversation. It was about acknowledging the connection, the lineage, the debt that could never really be repaid. The Graceland incident is really about something larger than one night in Memphis. It's about influence, about how artists shape the people who come after them. Elvis Presley changed the trajectory of Bruce Springsteen's entire life with a television appearance that lasted maybe 8 minutes. And Springsteen went on to influence countless others the same way. That's how culture perpetuates itself. A kid in New Jersey sees something on television and decides that's what he wants to do with his life. He spends years developing his craft, builds his own sound, achieves his own success, and somewhere another kid sees him and gets inspired to pick up a guitar. Springsteen understood this intuitively. He talked about how Elvis freed the body while Bob Dylan freed the mind. Both were necessary. Both were revolutionary in their own ways. And both created space for people like Springsteen to exist, to have careers, to connect with audiences. The fact that Springsteen never got to thank Elvis personally probably haunted him. That's why he kept telling the story, why he wrote songs about Elvis, why he'd pay tribute whenever he could. It was a way of completing a conversation that never got to happen, of saying thank you across the void. And in a strange way, getting turned away at the gates might have been better than meeting Elvis in 1976. The mythology remained intact. Springsteen didn't have to reconcile the Elvis of his imagination with the Elvis of reality, at least not face to face. He got to keep the dream alive, even as he wrote songs processing what Elvis had become. On the cover of Born to Run, if you look closely at Springsteen's guitar strap, you can see an Elvis fan club button. It's right there in the photo, this small declaration of allegiance. Eric Miola took the photo, and it was just one of many shots from that session. But that button made it into the final image that defined Springsteen for a generation. It's a tiny detail, but it says everything. Even as Springsteen was being hailed as rock's new sensation, as critics compared him to Dylan and labeled him the future, he was wearing an Elvis fan club button. He wasn't hiding his influences or pretending to have emerged fully formed. He was saying, this is where I come from. This is who made me possible. That button connects directly to the Graceland story. It's the same impulse that made him climb that wall. The desire to acknowledge the debt, to be close to the source, to say thank you in whatever way possible. Whether it's wearing a button or jumping a fence at 3 in the morning, it all comes from the same place. Years later, when Springsteen had achieved superstardom that rivaled or exceeded Elvis's fame, he'd look back on the Graceland incident with a mix of embarrassment and understanding. He'd note that he hated it when people showed up at his house uninvited, which made his own behavior somewhat hypocritical. But he also understood why people did it because he'd done it himself. That's the thing about fame and fandom. The line between admiration and obsession can get blurry. What seemed like a grand romantic gesture at 3 in the morning might look different in the light of day. But Springsteen owned it, made it part of his story, used it to illustrate something about the relationship between artists and their influences. The story also reveals something about Springsteen's character. He was willing to take risks, to put himself out there, to face rejection in pursuit of connection. That same quality drove his music, his 4-hour concerts, his determination to reach every person in every audience. He'd jump the wall, metaphorically and literally, to make something happen. And there's something touching about the whole thing. This wasn't a calculated publicity stunt. It was a genuine moment of fandom, captured in time. Bruce Springsteen loved Elvis Presley enough to do something foolish. That's relatable. That's human. That's what makes the story endure. Today, both Graceland and Bruce Springsteen are institutions. You can tour Elvis's home, see the rooms where he lived, stand in the spot where Springsteen stood outside those gates. The story of the boss jumping the wall has become part of Graceland's mythology, one of many tales about devoted fans trying to get close to Elvis. For Springsteen, the incident represents a moment in time before superstardom completely changed his life. He was famous, but not so famous that security guards recognized him on sight. He was successful, but still young enough and bold enough to scale a wall at 3 in the morning. He was between worlds, no longer an unknown, not yet an icon. The story has been told and retold so many times that it's taken on the quality of myth. Did it happen exactly as described? Probably close enough. The core truth remains: Bruce Springsteen, one of the greatest rock musicians of his generation, once climbed a fence at 3 in the morning hoping to meet his idol, and got turned away by security. It's perfect in its imperfection, and that's what makes it such a great story. It's not about triumph, it's about the attempt. It's about caring enough to try, even knowing you might fail. It's about the kid who saw Elvis on television never really going away, even after that kid grew up to be the boss. Elvis Presley died on August 16th, 1977, 16 months after Springsteen jumped his wall. He was 42 years old. The news shocked the world even though his decline had been visible for years. For Springsteen, it meant the door that had been closed that night at Graceland was now permanently sealed. There would never be another chance. In the decades since, Springsteen has continued to pay tribute to Elvis in various ways. He's covered Elvis songs in concert. He's spoken eloquently about Elvis's influence on American culture. He's acknowledged the debt that he and every other rock musician owe to the man who helped create the template they all follow. But beneath all the public tributes and acknowledgments, there's still that image. A 26-year-old musician running across a lawn at 3 in the morning, hoping against hope that his hero might answer the door. It's a moment of pure fandom, unguarded and genuine, and it's a reminder that even legends start as fans, inspired by someone who came before. The dream Elvis whispered to that 7-year-old watching The Ed Sullivan Show never went away. It just changed forms, evolved, became the fuel for Springsteen's own music and career. And when he finally had the courage to act on it, to try to connect with the source of that dream, reality intervened in the form of a security guard and a locked gate. Sometimes the most meaningful encounters are the ones that never happen. The conversation Springsteen never had with Elvis lives on as possibility, untarnished by reality. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe that's how it was always meant to be. The dream stays a dream, perfect and unchanging, even as everything else moves on. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.